Do this in remembrance of me. We immediately recognize these words of Jesus from the Last Supper. We repeat them every time we celebrate the Lord's Supper. Interestingly, however, Mark doesn't record these words. His telling of the Last Supper is extremely short, unlike John's version, for example, which takes up fully 5 chapters. However, there is one place in Mark where Jesus does say the words "in remembrance of," but it's not in remembrance of him, but in remembrance of her. Who is she? Let's find out. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas, and this is your daily devotional for Thursday, March 28th, 2024. All 4 Gospels tell some version of this story, but they vary widely about when and where it happened and who did it. In spite of the differences between the accounts, though, they all seem to come from the same incident in Jesus' life. Like Matthew, Mark places the story just before the Last Supper. For Mark, it is pivotal to the story because Mark seems to imply that it made Judas so mad that it caused him to go and conspire with the chief priests to betray Jesus. Here's how Mark tells the story. While he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at the table, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment of nard, and she broke open the jar and poured the ointment on his head. But there were some there who said to one another in anger, "Why was that ointment wasted in this way? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii, and the money given to the poor." And they scolded her. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has performed a good service for me. For you always have the poor with you, and you can show kindness to them whenever you wish. But you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for its burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her." Isn't that striking? In remembrance of her. Only Luke's account and Paul's account in 1 Corinthians include Jesus saying in the Last Supper, "in remembrance of me." So what is this story really about? Who is this woman, and why does Jesus say she will be remembered whenever the good news is proclaimed? The question of who is complicated. Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't name her. In Luke's version of the story, which may or may not tell the same event, she is described as a sinner, and tradition further identifies her as a prostitute. John's version of the story calls her Mary, presumably the sister of Martha and Lazarus. While it is tempting to harmonize the stories, it is often a mistake to do so. The Gospels were written decades after Jesus' death and were written based on stories that had been passed around orally for decades. And as we know, stories have a way of morphing and changing as they're passed around. Better to take each account on its own and not try to create a smooth amalgam of them, which is to say, we simply don't know who or what kind of woman this was, let alone her name. Yes, she could have been Mary, and or she could have been a prostitute. Mark simply doesn't say. What is much more important is what she does. Knowingly or not, she anoints Jesus' body the way one would anoint the body of a dead person. For Jesus, this foreshadows the death he knows he will suffer in just a day or two. But it also serves as the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, at least for Judas. For the very next thing that Mark tells us is this: "Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them." Apparently scandalized by the perceived waste of money on the ointment and Jesus' lack of concern for the extravagant gesture, Judas seems to have decided that Jesus needed to be stopped. So there is an intentional contrast here between Judas, one of the 12, and this unnamed woman. He acts out of a misplaced sense of outrage. while she acts out of an apparent sense of deep devotion to Jesus, to the point of extravagance. The irony is that both will be remembered as long as the good news is told, but for very, very different reasons. Judas for his outrageous act of betrayal, the unnamed woman for her extravagant act of devotion. Judas for his misplaced anger, the woman for her deep and abiding love. Tonight, when we celebrate the Lord's Supper at the Maundy Thursday service, the focus will be on that supper and the words of Jesus about love. This simple act of devotion by this unnamed woman tells us all we need to know. Tomorrow, a choice: Jesus or Barabbas. But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.